clickbait, or is it? I am a huge fan of contrarian channels, and I think many of you will agree with me, even if you don't agree with them, that they have a great entertainment value. In any case, I truly respect and admire channels like US Watchdog, Donegan Kaiser's channel, Trends in the News, Gerald Celente. Most of their guests and some channels are pure gold as education value, perhaps pure Bitcoin, Peter Schiff. George Gammon channel for one, I watch the Bond King, Lynette Zhang, Mario Eneko. I can't list them all, no offense, but you guys are brilliant, and thank you for your service to society, and thanks YouTube for giving them a voice. But I often hear Greg Hunter asking how the world would look like after the reset, and many doomsday scenarios are sort of, I would call them American centrists. Obviously they are intended for English speaking public, but I would like to contribute with this English as a third language channel and modestly expand their horizons, because frankly some of the views expressed seem naive and misinformed. As somebody who was born and raised on the other side of the Iron Curtain, I find YouTube content with true stories from back then and there wanting. So I made a list of bullet points, and I will make separate videos on each one of them. And the first one I want to start with is the freedom of movement, because these are the times where we all feel it. And the freedom of movement is one of the fictional human rights of which George Carlin spoke, that you only have temporary privileges. And I would like to remind all that up until recently, this was really a privilege to at least a large part of the world population. And I won't be surprised if the cycle turns and again it becomes a privilege to all, except for, of course, the privileged minority. I would like to invoke the memories of my fellow third world Europeans. Guys, please speak up, comment, correct, and fill the gaps. Hate. Right to the point, my memories when I was a child and young teenager, we used to have back then in my country two kinds of passports. One was issued when you were 16, it was a photo ID, a green passport, and the other was called an international passport, a red one, again a photo ID. And the green passport was used to travel inside the country. Like whenever you moved, the law was such that, I think still is, you could be stopped at any point by police and asked to present your ID, and you have to pull out your green passport or else you could be arrested. And of course back then nobody was bold enough to talk back to the police, argue about his human rights or cite the Constitution, because he would get his ass kicked and there will be no repercussions to the officers that kicked his ass. Then you of course could apply and get the international passport, the red one, but I guess for the majority of us common people it would have been a cruel joke to have it. Well, I mean, you could travel. I remember there were touristic groups that were visiting other East European countries and the great Soviet Union, but you couldn't go west, and for us even Yugoslavia was west, was the enemy. So only special privileged class could have traveled abroad to the west. That would have been high-ranking party members, I guess some specialists who were sent to third world countries in engineering projects to earn wages in US dollars, which I guess were shamelessly confiscated by the state. It's possible that the people who you met before 1989 in the West, like the chances are more than 50% that they were there in their capacity of spies or something like that, you know, be that economic, military, or in some other capacity. There is something very important that we should never forget and you should learn and remember. We used to have the so-called citizenship or domicile, or I don't know how to translate it. It was really called citizenship, which meant that every citizen of the country had a permanent address, and you were kind of grounded around your address. You could not just say sit in a car and drive from New York to LA and rent an apartment there legally, sign a lease and find a job there. You could only purchase real estate. Well, it was, I guess, a bit different, but you could only lease or buy a home in the town where you have an address registration, and you can only look for a job and apply for a job in that area of your citizenship. Now, while I'm on the subject, I remember that whenever somebody was infected with something really infectious, like a child gets measles or something, they would put a red sign on the door of your apartment or a house that used to say quarantine, and you were supposed to stay there for, I don't know, the duration of the disease or something. But okay, that's besides the point of freedom of movement. I will make a separate video on our medical files that followed us throughout our lifetime. That is not to say that you would be prevented from traveling from one city to the other, board public transportation vehicle, or drive your own car, because in the 80s already almost every family had a personal car. You could, and the chances to be stopped and asked where you were going were known. But the fact is that by law you could only visit there as a tourist or a guest. You couldn't live there permanently legally. People, of course, went illegally to big cities, you know. It was a country of small farmers that was quickly industrialized. So many people were forced to flock into cities and lease basements illegally, stay there and work kind of not with a permanent contract. There were ways around it. It wasn't so bad, but I'm just saying that these things existed by law, and if the laws were so complicated, as they are everywhere now, that you would always be caught in breaching one of them. And that will be my next video, the social score, as to why you may be targeted. But time being, I'm only dealing with the restrictions to travel. So you couldn't travel abroad, you couldn't move from a city to a city. That's a fact, and I remember it very well. It wasn't much of a benefit to move around as well, because they were trying to secure employment for everybody, and the wages were fixed. Practically they had a ceiling, so you couldn't do much. Even if you moved to another city, you wouldn't be making money out of your wages. People were bartering a lot back then with all kinds of consumer goods. There were stimulus packages for young families to move into uninhabited places. Like we have these mountains to the southeast that are uninhabited and remain uninhabited. But back then there was a whole program for young families to go there, and they would be given an apartment and I guess some grant, but I'm not sure about it. I was way too young to remember. I remember that we lived in a constant state of fear. You know, we were fearful that the enemy will attack, somebody will sabotage something, and especially on holidays there were extra patrols on the streets, and all kinds of measures were taken. Any Westerner who entered the country was probably followed. Thorough record of his movements and actions was taken. This seemed quite normal to us, to the locals. I never overheard my parents or grandparents complaining. And while I'm on the subject, I remember how the communication was back then. You don't talk anything sensitive on the phone. Now when I watch some Hollywood dystopian scenarios, I can't help but laugh. The protagonist is calling from abroad, and he's trying to reach his love interest or something. Like back then, making an international phone call was impossible, and everybody knew that the fixed phones, there were no cell phones back then, of course, were either randomly or constantly listened to, recorded. That was a common knowledge. You wouldn't dare tell a political anecdote over the phone. They were whispered. And all this seemed normal. Nobody seemed to protest. I will make a separate video of the signs that the system was crumbling. It came all of a sudden. I don't think the majority expected anything like this. But you will be impressed with what I remember at the end of the regime. There was absolutely no visible dissent. Majority of the people were quite happy with their living conditions and were accepting some sacrifices as necessary. But there was no open dissent or an underground movement or anything of that sort. And I had a happy childhood. Probably one of the most important things I remember was the nearly religious belief in the higher quality of the Western goods. They were not available, they were extremely exotic and rare. And to us children, it was especially sensitive because I'm talking about chocolate bars, chewing gums, and of course Kinder Surprise, the chocolate egg, was the most prized possession you could ever have. You could trade it, you could do anything with it. They were just worth gold, these things. And of course there were sailors, international travelers, people who smuggled anything that you can imagine back in the country, and they could sell whatever they smuggled at extremely high prices. I guess it was powers of 10-20 times the price of the goods they purchased abroad. But it didn't change our belief in the righteousness of our system. Any adult could have explained to us that all these amazing products of human engineering labor come from exploitation of the poor citizens of the capitalist countries, and they, just like us, cannot afford to enjoy them. Obviously only the privileged capitalist minority could afford to buy them. The rest were living in their slums, unemployed, unable to feed their sick children who had no health insurance. And the Western movies that reach us, they only confirmed some of these points. What is ironic, I found out later on that the Soviet bloc was criticized by the West for forbidding its citizens to travel freely. But ironically, when the Berlin Wall fell, we now needed visas to go and visit Western countries. So we remained prisoners for at least another decade. Now let's be serious for a second here. Is freedom of movement necessarily a positive, universally positive thing? I want to think about it, and maybe I'll need a George Gammon's whiteboard presentation to stress on the economic impact of it. I will not even start on cultural discrepancies and incompatibilities. But the freedom of movement contributed to depopulation of vast areas. I must say that my country lost in 25 years probably a quarter to one third of its population. Not all through immigration, of course, but I think this was the major contributing factor. And I mean, that's fine. It is just a small country. We wouldn't even make a single village in China. But you should think about the freedom of movement for, say, the entire Indonesia. I will not mention India and China, but let's take Nigeria, let's take more populated countries. If this freedom was a true freedom, freedom to move and start working abroad, and vast human masses would move to developed countries, and they will exercise a downward pressure on the wages. And I know for a fact that a living wage is paid only in minority of the countries around the world. The vast majority of the world doesn't look for a job. It's the futile exercise, because even if you are employed, you still don't earn a living wage. Up until recently, for example, in my home country, the minimum wage in at least half of the population works around that mark, was insufficient to pay your utilities bill. Now, libertarians may argue that in a free world where freedom of movement is just part of the freedoms allowed, that extra labor will be eventually directed productively into sectors of economics that really need it, and they will start pointing out classic economic models of comparative advantage of the countries. Or say South Korea can produce airplanes and Vietnam rice, and the free trade would allow improved world GDP growth. Trade deficits will regulate themselves automatically. But we do not live in such a world, do we? We live in a world where the medium of exchange, the world reserve currency and all its derivatives, without having much utility, are perceived as having value on their own. So the issuer can acquire world's wealth without manufacturing much else. And that's the ultimate comparative advantage, Ricardo. The population paid in reserve currency doesn't even need to go to work and produce anything, and can cheaply acquire imported goods, just shop online. I guess only locally provided services will go up and up in price, but if you lock these down and just print some more money to the suffering owners, you might get away with it. It would be problematic for the rest of the world to come look at the telephone numbers of valuations locally and conclude that what they've been paid for their labor is virtually nothing. Certain professions, certain highly paid jobs will be protected for a while by licensing regimes, professional orders, bars, organizations. These will force the newcomers to jump through all kinds of hoops for a while. But the majority of the overpaid commoner, relative to the rest of the world overpaid, of course, will suffer tremendously. They have not lived without running water or electricity for generations, So why change? Why cause worldwide suffering? Also, if you allow me to butcher and downgrade some economic theories because they are not entirely repudiated yet, at current state of automation, aren't we already at the crisis of capitalism, where no more added value can be extracted from human labor? What is the use of this extra labor in developed countries then? Can it really be productively redeployed with another industrial revolution? Are we there yet? Are we about to make another quantum leap ahead? Can we make use of double-digit IQs, or are they just a drag? I'm going too far with this, huh? I guess my question should be rather, what is your creed? Religious, optimistic belief in intelligent design of a benevolent creator who took care of it all from the start? Or a Malthusian pessimistic view of exponential rise of population as opposed to linear increase of resources? But I guess it doesn't matter what you and I believe in if we are not the decision makers, right? You remember how I started this video? I was talking about phone calls made on fixed phones. Who do you think allocates frequencies for mobile operators? What I was talking about was a small backward country many years ago. And imagine a state with resources and technology to impose its beliefs on every single individual 24/7.